Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Red, White, and Blind. This is Tony Bersunas, and if you're new here, the purpose of the show is to break the spells of the corporate mainstream media to discern the story behind the story. Our last video was on the origin of the coronavirus, and just since that video went live, there's been quite a few developments in the story, and so I wanted to just update you and sort of go over these developments in the story. I specifically mentioned the New York Times in the first video that they hadn't run a piece that was neutral about the origin of the coronavirus until this day. And after my video went live, shortly thereafter, they released another article, and it's once again really muddying the waters. And so we're going to take a look at that as well as some of the other developments. So let's get started. All right, well, welcome back. So, first of all, why are we talking about the coronavirus and the origin of this virus? Well, it's arguably the most important thing that's happened in our lifetime. We could argue about 9/11 or some of the other events that have happened, and depending on how long you've been alive, maybe there's been more important events to you in your lifetime. But in terms of global events, it's certainly near the top, with the lockdowns that took place, with all of the people that died, with the vaccines and how that's rolled out, all of the issues, all of the economic hardship and health hardship that's gone on, the fact that we haven't been able to ask and really understand the origin of this virus and come to an agreement as a society as to where this virus originated, I think really bears our attention. And the reason I made the first video was for this reason. We do need to be able to understand where this virus came from. So since that video came out, and I do suggest you watch that video first if you haven't seen it. I am trying to build the channel, but more than that, that video really lays out the basics. It talks about Shi Zhengli, the scientist in Wuhan, and her story. It also talks about Peter Daszak and, of course, Tony Fauci, and why it's almost certain, based on the amount of evidence that has come out favoring the origin of the virus coming out of a lab, why it's almost certainly the case that happened. So that video is right here. Feel free to take a look. In fact, I recommend if you haven't watched it, go watch it right now and then come back and watch this one. All right, so since the video went out, immediately the Department of Energy, which is an agency of our government, of course, came out with a statement on the origin of the virus. And just to be clear, before we get into what their statement was, the notion that the virus came out of a lab was considered a wild, crazy conspiracy theory for a long time in the mainstream media, in the New York Times and NPR and a lot of these sort of mainstream journalists, mainstream media publications. So the Department of Energy comes out, this is just last month, in March, came out and said, now they said this with a low level of confidence, but still, what a mind-changing or what a mind-bending declaration. They said, we think this virus probably came out of the lab in Wuhan, China. And it's just stunning, I think, that came out. I mean, how is it possible that an unhinged, quote-unquote, unhinged conspiracy theory now is what the government agencies are concluding is probably the case? And I think it's important just to pause there and think about the number of things that have been considered wild, crazy conspiracy theories that have just eventually been acknowledged as like, oh yeah, that's probably what happened. The number of those things has certainly increased in this era since COVID. So the Wall Street Journal ran an article about that, about the Department of Energy statement, and that sort of made its way around the media. In addition to that, before we get into the New York Times piece that came out, then we have Robert Redfield, who is the former head of the CDC. He was the head of the CDC during COVID through 2020, and then he stepped down in 2021. As I mentioned in my other video, the first thing he did when he stepped down as the head of the CDC is he gave an interview on CBS, and he said, well, now that I can speak freely, this virus came out of a lab. He's like, I'm fairly certain about it. So that was Redfield in 2021. He's said much more about that ever since. But recently he's said even more in congressional testimony and in a number of other places. He's given these bombshell comments that he now lays at the feet of Anthony Fauci the deaths in the United States from this pandemic, more or less. I mean, he basically says, not only did this virus come out of a lab, but Fauci knew it, and all of the people at the NIH, many of them knew it as well, and did nothing about it, or I guess didn't follow what naturally would happen if you knew the origin of the virus. You would certainly deal with things much differently. So that's Robert Redfield's testimony. In addition to that, and I did mention this at the end of the first video, The Nation magazine and some other publications were successful in obtaining emails from Dr. Fauci and the NIH and Peter Daszak about the origin of the virus from early on. And we now know that they were talking amongst themselves about this before they wanted to come out and publish that paper. There's a paper that came out in Nature magazine and then also the Lancet journal that I mentioned in the first video, saying we know that this virus came out of a wet market, naturally emerged in a wet market. And we now know from these emails that that was not the case, that behind the scenes, several of the scientists that Fauci talked to were pretty certain it had come out of a lab. And two of the most prominent virologists that had that belief were given $9 million grants at their institutions, and then they changed their mind. So this is really a bombshell, because if you understand how, if you've worked in academia, if you know somebody that's worked in academia, if you know how science institutions function, many of them rely on grants from places like the NIH. In fact, the majority of them do. So for Fauci to do this, to say, you know, if you're going to say that the virus came out of a lab, we're not going to give you a grant, but if you change your mind, you do. Now, the quid pro quo there hasn't been established, but the timing of it is just absolutely unbelievable. And what that does, I mean, if you work in academia, if you're able to be the person that brings in a $9 million grant and then hand out that work and continue with your funding, it's the difference between having a career and not having a career in academia. The amount of prestige you get, the amount of power you get in these institutions is really unparalleled. And that's how a lot of science works in the United States right now. And I have some friends who do work in these places, and I've talked to them about this. So that came out. Now let's get to the New York Times. So the New York Times, we've had the DOJ, the government saying DOE, the Department of Energy coming out saying this came out of a lab. We have Robert Redfield, the former head of the CDC. We have the emails. And then the New York Times runs this piece. And I kid you not, I said in my first piece, and I say in my book, Red, White, and Blind, which I do recommend you get. I spent a lot of time researching it. Packed everything I could into this book. Now let's get to the New York Times. And let's see what this piece is called. I'll just bring it up here. It's what we know about... Okay, they changed the title. The Origins of the COVID Pandemic. What we know and what we don't know, right? So the New York Times runs this piece sort of, with this great title saying, okay, great, we can delve into it. And so for people that have questions, they can come and read about it. And it talks about the Department of Energy statement. And then what is just absolutely unbelievable about this article is it just runs over the same thing they've been running over. And then they add one new thing to this to try to muddy the waters. And I should say, before we even get into it, there's no apology in this article. There's no apology for what they did in 2020 and in 2021, which was calling even the notion that it could have maybe come out of a lab a wild conspiracy theory. There's no apology for that, and now they're doing it again. They're absolutely muddying the waters here on this just absolutely essential story. So they talk about there's this new animals that they found. They're not raccoons, they're not dogs, they're raccoon dogs. And they talk about how the raccoon dogs, throughout this article, it's about might have and could have. There's no certainty to it. There's not even a study that they're citing. There's just a couple of scientists have come out and they're preparing a preprint of something that might be something, and they're constantly playing up the political angle of it instead of the science, which really, it makes you pause. Why in COVID could we not just do science? Why did there have to be the Republican science and the Democrat science? And that's really something I want people to understand here at Red, White, and Blind, that we're all in a state of deception. And we're in a state of deception because the corporate media is infiltrated and it is deceptive and is deliberately so. And some of the deception is done just by systemic bias, by the people that have to get their paycheck at these big corporate institutions. And some of it is nefarious bias, where they're actually planting stories, such as in this case, where there was a nefarious work at play to prevent people from asking the question about the virus. So now the New York Times, here we are in 2023, still running a piece that is intended to muddy the waters. These raccoon dogs, there's no evidence that they passed on COVID. There's not even evidence that they ever had COVID. No raccoon dogs were ever. The issue is because, bats are not in Wuhan, and humans didn't clearly get the virus directly from bats. So for this natural theory, for you to believe in it, there has to be an intermediary species. That's been the problem, and no intermediary species has ever been identified. First they talked about it, maybe it was a pangolin, but that didn't pan out. Then there were a couple of other ideas of like ferrets that they brought out and things. Now it's raccoon dogs. And the only evidence they have in this entire story is that there's evidence that raccoon dogs left some genetic material, which means they pooped or they bled, somewhere in one of the markets. And in that market, people were found to have the coronavirus. That's it. That's the hard evidence they have. There's nothing there. I mean, all that means, and the raccoon dogs never actually had COVID. So all that means is that there happened to be animals in a place that people later got COVID, and that we just haven't talked about raccoon dogs yet. That's the entire story of the New York Times. But they run this whole piece to just bring up doubt, to sow doubt in people's minds. I really think it's for people, this article is not for people with an open mind. This article is for the good, millions of people who just get their news from the New York Times and don't really want to consider that they could have been wrong all along. That's what this is for. It's now 99% certain that this came out of a lab, but this article is for people that are just totally committed to the blue side of the news, to the Democrat side of the news, that they only want to see things that way. They're not interested in actual science. And it's even a little deeper than that. The New York Times is so strongly arrayed against Trump, I would say, and because Trump at one point said this came out of a lab, there's almost this effort by the New York Times to allow people who never want to think that anything Trump has said could be true to continue to believe that. Right? Because to say, oh, Trump was right when we were wrong, I think that would undermine a major part of the narrative structure of people that are fully invested in the New York Times. So that's the article. I'll let you take a look at it. Of course, I'll put the link in it. I'm not going to read it line by line here, but if you read through it, it's just full of how, maybe and how it could have. And even in those sentences, they're still never disproving the lab leak theory, which there's so much evidence for. Here's a sentence. Some of those scientists have studied maps of where investigators found the virus in the market, including walls, floors, and other surfaces, and found that those samples clustered in an area of the market where live animals were sold. That's probably also because that's where the people were. The raccoon dog DNA came from one of those stalls. That's our evidence. So there was some raccoon dog DNA found where other animals are sold, which is where the people were. And then there's just some people suggest, other scientists dispute. Anyway, I'll let you take a look at that article. It's interesting to note that The Atlantic, of course, The Atlantic, which is very closely aligned with the New York Times, has also run a piece supporting the New York Times efforts to muddy the waters on the origin of the virus. So where are we left with this? I mean, the truth is, at this point, the New York Times obfuscating notwithstanding, there's actually even more evidence now than there ever has been of the lab origin. And let's just go over it quickly. So, as I mentioned before, first we've had the Furin cleavage sites. So this was one of the first things that sort of showed a lot of the scientists that were looking at the virus that most likely this came out of a lab, because you have what are called Furin cleavage sites in the virus DNA. And this is almost always from human manipulations of a virus. So that was a smoking gun, and now we have even more evidence about that. There's even in the emails for Fauci, they even mention that some of the unusual features potentially look engineered. That's about the Furin cleavage sites. But now we know even more. If the Furin cleavage sites weren't enough, we've also learned about seamless ligation, and that this technology was also taught to Shizheng Li and the people in the Wuhan lab. And what seamless ligation is it's a method to mask human manipulation of viruses, right? So that if you go in and you monkey around with the virus because you're experimenting with it, you're taking a coronavirus from a bat in a cave in Yunnan province, and then you're maybe grafting on certain other things, you're trying to make it, basically gain-of-function research is to make a virus more transmissible or more deadly. And so as you do those things, you make manipulations. Then what you can do is you can run it through this process called seamless ligation that then makes it almost impossible to then go back and look and see evidence of human manipulation. And now we know that that technology was taught to Shizheng Li in the lab by Robert Barrick of the UNC lab, the lab in North Carolina, which has done a lot of the American manipulation of virus technology. And that's where all of this was done before this type of research was banned in the Obama administration. And then Fauci worked around that ban by funding through Peter Daszak and the EcoHealth Alliance. They funded this technology in Wuhan to get around the ban and continued to manipulate these viruses for years. Obviously, the Obama administration ended in 2016. So in the mid-teens, they sort of offshored this dangerous work to China. But now that we know that they taught them this seamless ligation, that they were using that technology, I mean, just as an aside, why do we have this technology, right? What is the purpose for it? If people say that, what they like to say is that this technology, that the reason we're doing gain-of-function research is to try to get out ahead of a pandemic, to try to experiment, make these viruses more deadly, to just then we'll be able to know in advance if it might become deadly to humans. When in fact, this research has almost always historically been done for weapon development, for bio and chemical weapon development, biological weapons. And so that's most clearly, it supports that notion that this was developed as a bioweapon, that they were using seamless ligation. Because if you're just experimenting for the sake of just playing around with the virus to try to get out ahead of a natural pandemic, you would want to leave the signals in that this was human manipulated, so that then people could look and say, oh, this is a human manipulated one, we don't need to worry about it, or we don't need to worry about it yet, or it just would be useful to know that. But if you're actually trying to cloak it using this cloaking technology, that really makes it seem like this was part of biological weapons development. So that's another real problem. And then even if the Furin cleavage sites and the seamless ligation are not enough, and like I said, the seamless ligation tries to cloak that humans manipulated the virus, but the Furin cleavage sites is one of the things that you can't really hide, and so that's why, and that almost always indicates human manipulation. So we have both of those present in this case. Then there's this also David Martin, who's a doctor, and I think he's a lawyer as well, I'll link to his video, has done some work researching some of the work done in this lab in the 2010s and some of the patents that were applied for. And those patents show that they were manipulating coronaviruses, and they were using Furin cleavage sites. So we now have that evidence as well. And I'll link to that article. I think at the end of the day, as I mentioned in the original video, it's just ridiculously suspicious to think that a lab in Wuhan is experimenting with bat coronaviruses harvested from bats in a cave in Yunnan province, and comes back and is working on making them more dangerous and more deadly. And it's the only lab in the world doing this. And then in that very same city, a couple years later, a bat coronavirus that's been, it seems, more transmissible and more deadly than it would have otherwise been emerges. As Alina Chan mentioned, and I also talked about this in the other video, the MIT virologist who wrote Viral, a great book, actually, that you should check out, where she looks deeply into this question of where the virus came from. And she says, she concludes, it's just so wildly unlikely. And she compares it to if you went to Wuhan in 2018 and funded an experiment of putting horns on horses, and just let's see if you can get horns to grow on horses. And then you came back 2 years later and there's unicorns galloping around in Wuhan. It would just be very interesting and very unusual, right, to see that level of a coincidence. So that's what we have at this point. I mean, I should say here, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. I can read scientific papers, and I've done that quite a bit in this case. And certainly it is still possible. While it's, I would say, 99% likely that it came out of a lab, it is still possible that, an animal, I mean, bats aren't common in Wuhan, but you have that. But let's say a coronavirus somehow could have moved through a intermediary species and infected people in Wuhan. It is still possible. Highly, highly unlikely, and relative to the evidence that has emerged for the lab leak theory, I think essentially impossible, but it is still possible. What I think is interesting for our purposes is the way that one side of the media, and the red side of the media gets stories wrong all the time, and they were not perfect on this by any means, but it was the blue side of the media, the New York Times and NPR and The Atlantic and CNN and MSNBC, that got this so completely wrong and still have not apologized or in any way made proclamations that they'll do a better job. Why they did that, it seems again like this was politics, not science. That because Trump had said this might have come out of a lab, that's why they deceived people. And it goes much deeper than that as well. They were also deceiving us, attempting to deceive all of us to protect very powerful people. Fauci and the NIH and possibly forces darker than that were really interested in developing a biological weapon in Wuhan. That element of the story I haven't investigated enough. Others have. What we do know is that this was one of the most consequential stories of our lifetime, and the New York Times got it wrong, and not by accident. In the same way that the weapons of mass destruction that led to the absolutely catastrophic war in Iraq, they were wrong on that and not by accident. And I think we need to realize this. They're doing it again. The New York Times, as I talk about in my book and investigate in depth, has an agenda all its own. Its agenda is not to inform people. It's not all the news that's fit to print. It's managed behind the scenes by the machinations of intelligence agencies. We know that through Operation Mockingbird, and it's still going on today, that there are people manipulating the news every day. And this also isn't to say that the New York Times is wrong about everything. I read the New York Times. I still do. It's in my balanced media diet. I read it several times a week. Every day there's some great pieces in there. And I'm not saying that it's all bad. What I am saying is that despite that, and as my co-author in Red, White, and Blind, Ashley Rinsberg, so eloquently put in his book, The Gray Lady Winked, which I recommend you look at and that you read, they've gotten some of the most consequential stories completely dead wrong for our lifetimes, and going back to the famines in Russia under Stalin, going back to the Holocaust in Germany, and many other stories. And they will continue to do this. The media will continue to do this. Corporate media has systemic and nefarious bias that absolutely affects its coverage of every single story, including, and most importantly and most frequently, the most controversial stories. If it's an article about, a sports game, or it's an article about a restaurant review, typically it's going to be very high quality and shoot straight. But if it's an article about national politics or global politics, or it's an article about some global cultural issue, most likely it's going to be heavily manipulated. And that's just the story. And so really the moral of the story here, in addition to we should stop deliberately experimenting with viruses and covering it up, we should certainly stop that. In addition to that, all of us should balance our media diet, and that's, I think, is the most important thing. Without a balanced media diet, I would have been misinformed, you would have been misinformed, and we will continue to be misinformed about the most consequential stories of our day. So here it is, the origin of the virus. It's continuing today. The evidence continues to mount on one side, not on the other. The media continues to cover it in a highly biased way. Call me crazy if you're lazy. That's how I see it. This has been Red, White, and Blind. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.